Hello and welcome to my first video in a mini-series that I'm going to be doing about stripes. I don't feel I've covered the subject of knitting stripes in flat knitting well enough, so I'm going to expand on that and I'm going to cover how to change the colour of yarn and also how to carry yarn up the side of your knitted work. This first video is going to cover simple stripe making basics, and I'm going to be showing you two slightly different techniques for adding a stripe. When you're adding a stripe to your knitting, there are really only two different scenarios. One is where you're going to add a one-off stripe, so you're not going to repeat the stripe or do another stripe in the same colour later on in your knitting. If you're doing a one-off stripe like that, then you will need to cut the yarn at the beginning and the end of the stripe. This is also the case even if later on in your knitting you're planning to come back to the same colour and do another stripe in that colour. It's all about how much distance there is between stripes of the same colour. So for instance, if you're adding a red stripe and then you're planning to do another red stripe after another 40 or 50 more rows of a different colour, then you would still cut the yarn before and after each of those stripes. However, if you were doing a red stripe and then a stripe of another colour for about 5 rows, and then you're going to be wanting to use the red yarn again for another stripe, then you wouldn't cut the yarn at the end of the first stripe. Instead, you would do something called carrying the yarn. If you want to carry a yarn, for instance red yarn in between two different red stripes, then all this involves is the red yarn being brought up one side of your knitted work. This red yarn is anchored to your knitted work at regular intervals, using whatever colour yarn you're knitting with. I will be showing you the technique of carrying yarns later on in this mini-series. Often when you do stripes, you alternate between 2 or 3 different colours, and carrying yarns is a perfect technique to use for that. This video, however, deals with techniques you would use when you're doing a one-off stripe, so a stripe in a colour that you're not going to then repeat in your knitting, or you're doing a stripe that's not going to be repeated for quite a lot of rows. Okay, so as you can see, I've already done a few stripes, and I'm currently knitting in a cream coloured yarn. Because we're not carrying yarns in this video, I'm going to now cut this cream coloured yarn to leave a yarn tail of about 12 inches. This will be woven in later. I'm now going to add in a rust brown coloured stripe. So I just arrange the end of the brown yarn into a hook, like so, with the yarn tail that should measure about 12 inches long away from you and the rest of the working yarn towards you. You then take your right hand needle and go into the top stitch as if to knit. I'm just going to be doing garter stitch throughout all of these videos. You then pick up the loop of brown yarn, keeping the tail end of the yarn away from you, and hook it over the right hand needle point, and then hold that against the right hand needle. You then simply complete a knit stitch as normal, and this incorporates that brown yarn into your knitting. And it's really as simple as that. Because at the start of a stripe, where you add the yarn, it's often quite loose, at least for the first few stitches, some people knot the two yarn tails together in order to hold them in place and allow you to pull on the yarn a little to tighten it up. So all you do is tie the yarn tails together loosely, because later on you'll be undoing that knot in order to weave in those yarn tails. However, it's completely optional. You don't need to add a knot if you don't want to. And then you just carry on knitting as normal. I'm just going to do knit stitches back and forth to bring me back to the point where I started this stripe. It is possible to make stripes without going back and forth across the rows. But usually, and especially if you want to carry yarns, you will be knitting both back and forth across each row as I'm doing here. So the previous brown stripes I have done on this knitting sample are the thinner stripes that you'll most likely come across, at least in flat knitting. In circular knitting, it's a lot easier to do single line stripes because you automatically come back to the point where you started your stripe due to knitting in the round. Whereas with flat knitting, you have to go back and forth across a row in order to get back to where you started. The next technique I'm going to show you is one where I will now switch back to the cream colour yarn and I will weave in the yarn tail as I go. So as before, I cut the current yarn, which is brown, to leave me with a yarn tail of about 12 inches. And then as before, I make a loop out of the cream coloured yarn, which is the yarn I'm going to make a stripe out of next. So again, I take my right hand needle up through the top stitch as if to knit, pick up the loop of cream yarn and drop it over the right hand needle point, and then complete a normal stitch in order to incorporate that new yarn. At this point, instead of dropping the cream yarn tail, I'm going to keep it in my right hand. And then I'm going to carry on knitting along the row. But I'm going to knit with both the cream yarn tail and the cream working yarn at the same time. So I'm basically just working with a double thickness of yarn. I do the same thing for about 4 or 5 stitches. And then I drop the yarn tail and continue just with the cream working yarn. And at the end, as you'll be able to see, that technique has woven in the cream yarn tail, so now I don't have to weave it in separately. So in one way it saves time, but the downside is that it knits with a double thickness of yarn, so it does make the area where the yarn tail is quite bulky. Please note that in the next row, you would just treat each of those double thickness stitches as a single stitch. And that's it, you've now added a stripe. If you want to make a wider stripe, then you can keep knitting for as long as you like, back and forth along the rows. If you then want to finish this stripe, you just simply cut the yarn to leave you with a yarn tail of about 12 inches, and then add in another colour for the next stripe. It's entirely up to you if you want to weave in the yarn tail ends as you go, or do them all after you've finished your knitting project. I really hope this video has been helpful, and I hope you'll join me for the next video. Thank you very much for watching.